All right. Item, do you want to do B1, the budget amendment?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And just to, as I get started out here, this budget amendment is essentially a contract that will be entered into between Macon County and the Office of State Budget Management for $100,000 to Macon County to be used for community purposes. Anything that we can spend this money on that will benefit the community. I'd like to say that this funding came about through Senator Davis, and there was money available actually in 16-17. We began having these discussions in July of 2016 about this money that was available, and he essentially said, listen, I would like to get $100,000 in funding for Macon County to be used for community purposes. And as the conversations progressed and spoke back and forth with Senator Davis and his office staff, we eventually started out as, hey, this would be great for the community funding pool. When we're thinking community purposes or community functions and touching those areas that in turn touch our community, we felt like it would be a great place to put those funds. As we got into the details and started reviewing the contract, we were, and I was under the assumption all along that the funds, that this $100,000 would come directly to Macon County, who could then simply put it in, if the board so desired, put it in the community funding pool, the monies that we already have, just stick it in that line item and move forward. Well, has anybody ever entered into a state contract? that wasn't the case. And as we started reviewing the documents, the contract was originally made between the Office of State Budget Management and the community funding pool. That was the first hurdle. Is the community funding pool is an advisory board. It's not a fiduciary. Therefore, it cannot accept funds in that manner. So once we got that hurdle overcame, we got the contract revised to be between the Office of State Budget Management and Macon County, who would then, as we thought, get the money and put it in those monies already appropriated for the community funding pool if the board so desired. As we started reading the terms and conditions of the contract, there was a few things that jumped out about these funds to us that were of great concern. And number one, and I'll just read some excerpts from these terms and conditions. The county would remain wholly responsible for the actions of the subgrantees that were recipients of this money. So it says here, the recipient, which would be Macon County, shall be responsible for the performance of all subcontractors and subrecipients and shall not be relieved of any of the duties and responsibilities of this contract as a result of entering into subcontracts or subgrants. Additionally, if said recipient subgrants any funds pursuant to this contract, recipient shall submit a copy of its policies and/or procedures for monitoring subrecipients to the agency. Essentially, what would happen is if these monies were placed, they would be different than the $75,000 that we appropriate and grant to, or approve the granting to the different community organizations that apply to the nonprofit funding pool. What this would require would be an administrative function of Macon County to basically specifically administer each of the grants that they gave out. So if that was five community funding pool applicants, then basically our finance office would be administering and overseeing those funds for 5 different subgrantees. If it was 10, they would be doing the same for 10. So it was creating some administration difficulties on the county, which we felt like would thereby reduce the efficiency and effectiveness of what our finance office is doing regarding our other operations currently. Also, we felt like that the most important thing here was that it would create, in putting this $100,000 in that pool, it would create inequity, because the way this is structured, all of the applicants to the community funding pool would not be eligible to receive funds from this $100,000. Any subcontracts, and I'm reading again from the terms and conditions, any subcontracts or subgrants entered into by the recipient with grant funds shall be subject to all conditions of this contract. In the insurance conditions of this contract, the subrecipients would have to have workers' compensation insurance, a minimum of $500,000, general commercial liability of $1 million, automobile liability insurance of $500,000. In these requirements, we felt many of these of the smaller agencies that would be applying to the community funding pool do not have these in place currently. So that was of some concern. Here again, just reading another excerpt to you, and yes, the one I just read, we felt like that while some of the people applying for these funds would be able to get these funds based on this, the ones that didn't have these insurances in place would not be capable to receive these funds. So that was an equity issue that gave us some concern, as all the subrecipients would not, we did not feel like would be on an equal playing field. Furthermore, all the subrecipients would have to be 501c3. And currently, the way it's structured, I know that some community organizations that we've provided funding to in the past that could be requesting this funding would not be set up as 501c3s. So again, I felt like there would be some inequity there due to that. So in closing, we worked with the Office of State Budget Management, Senator Davis and his office, to have it structured to where this money would be given to Macon County and be used for community purposes by Macon County. In doing that, we felt like we could put these funds toward a project that would touch the whole community, and that all these groups and entities that may have otherwise not been able to accept this money could benefit from this money as we applied it to a use, and we could oversee the funds and oversee the funds that we're ultimately responsible for over the course of the project. So what we're proposing to do, if the board is in agreement with this, is to put these funds toward the Robert C. Carpenter building project. What that would do is, first of all, that project is a project that's used all the way from your local basketball leagues, your local Little League baseball teams, your veterans, your many of the community groups that hold meetings there, your senior games. Basically, a whole wide variety of the community could benefit from these funds in that way. And so the reason that I discussed this budget amendment is because if the board does move forward with authorizing me to enter into the contract to accept these funds, then if we put those toward that project, then that will influence the money that we would otherwise be appropriating from fund balance to do this project. And it's essentially, the money started out all along as Senator Davis was made aware of monies that were available, and he wanted to be sure that Macon County got those monies to be used for community purposes. And so with that, I'll entertain any questions and be more than happy to discuss this further. That was just, as Lori and I looked at it, that made the most logical sense of giving the most people, allowing the most groups to be able to benefit from those funds.
It makes sense.
So will the money be made available?
It's going to be made available in this budget year as soon as we sign that contract. Now, from the time the contract's signed to the time we get the money,
You don't have a clue.
It's a reimbursement basis. I think, if I'm remembering right, though, for July through September, I can report any expenditures that have occurred and go ahead and submit it, and I think they'll reimburse on a
But
quarterly basis.
you don't get the $100,000 all at one time.
No.
That's right, you don't.
but you get it as you turn in the quarterly reimbursement.
And if you don't if you don't submit it in time, there's a lot of ifs and buts and bats about this money. There's been a lot of confusion about this money. So spend it all at one time if you can.
Yeah, I think we should spend the majority of it in July, August, September.
Yeah, you
and
need
probably
to.
the rest of it in October.
Need to spend it all at one lick, all you can. If it's the way to do it, that's up to the board, but you need to spend it all to get it all at one lick. Don't do it in $10,000 increments, because it gets real confusing. I guess you found that out, but
I think that's maybe a good thought, to be able to apply that towards the Carpenter building. I can't help but think back to our conversation 10 minutes ago when we were talking about Nantahala doesn't always get monies, and Highland and Scaly. So when you talk about from a community funding, I think if we had folks from Nantahala and somebody other than Jimmy from Highlands here and somebody from Scaly, they might argue that spending that money at the Carpenter building might not benefit.
And again, going back to, that was just the county. Another thing that I'd like to point out in this is that, the state auditor shall have access to persons and records as a result of all contracts or grants entered into by state agencies or political subdivisions in accordance with the North Carolina General Statute. Additionally, as the state funding authority, the agency shall have access to persons' record as a result of all contracts or grants entered into by state agencies or political subdivisions. And basically, that goes back to the administration, and we would essentially, if given to another agency, would be administering that grant for them, and we would be, and not saying that any agency is not up to snuff on bookkeeping or the records they keep or their accounting practices, but if the state auditor comes in and finds a problem with another agency, then first of all, the agency would have to be a 501c3, and if anything is amiss about what's done with that money or who the agency, how the agency uses that money, then the county is going to ultimately be held liable for it. And I think the only, behind our recommendation on that project was we already have a fund set up. We're already monitoring that fund. That and we would have direct oversight and control over those funds in accordance with how we do our accounting. It's acceptable because of our audit and all the checks and balances that we have in place. So I think that in looking at distributing those funds to that project, we certainly weren't dismissing the other needs in the community. It was just, hey, this is an ongoing project. We have an accounting system established for this project. We're already administering this project, so we would just put this money directly toward that project that we're already overseeing and administering. That is, it just happened to be a community building. So that was that. And Lori, I mean, you can feel free to speak. Is that kind of, that was kind of the conversation.
And this meets the criteria. It services a cross-section of the population. That's real important if you read that thing close.
And that
it's got to meet a cross-section of the population.
Go along with
the
Mr.
new
Clispy.
agreement. I'm sorry, Mr. Shields. Go ahead.
Go along with his thought, though. If we get this 100,000, we're saving 100,000 that we can put up here, that we make an earmark to what you're talking about,
Exactly.
and not have to go through all the red tape. What Paul's talked about, what we've all talked about here this evening, we can remember there's $100,000 here that we can look to the CIP plan or what it may be, that we can work towards assisting Nantahala. Just remember that 100,000 is there.
Right.
And that might be, but we can have both things.
And that was what we looked at. There are many other notable things like we've mentioned, and discussed here tonight, but with the strings and the terms and conditions put on this money, if we could administer it and our finance office have direct control and the knowing of where it's going, I mean, just as Mr. Shields said, that's freeing up $100,000 that would have otherwise been spent on the Carpenter building. That would be our money. That there are not these strings. The strings are not attached to that money like that.
And this is tax dollars that we're spending, that we're getting, so it's taking money out of the left pocket, putting it in the right pocket.
But this is tax dollars that was robbed from Macon County because we put it into a pot. That Macon County did not receive no tax dollars that was took out of Macon County and sent to other counties. That's what this money's from. This money was taken from Macon County and sent to other counties, and it was put into a pot of money. So this is our only opportunity to get any of that money back. That's what this money is. So I think it's a good idea to give to community building. It services the veterans, it services the community, everything from kids to veterans. You can't have a more cross-section of people. And of course the population, the vast majority of the population is in the county seat. So what do you need, a motion?
Yes.
So I make a motion, we let the county manager apply for this money, and if successful,
Or no, it would be signing the contract. We've got
an agreement.
you got an agreement. So
Approve the agreement.
let the county manager enter into a contract to hopefully get this $100,000 from the state and apply that to the Carpenter building, thereby releasing, putting back $100,000 into our general fund, and do that as soon as possible, Mr. Chairman. This form of a motion.
Could we,
A motion and a second.
could we add to that, subject to the review of legal counsel? I know that Chester, we had discussed.
Chester's going to review it regardless.
And
It
look-
you don't need that in a motion.
Looked at the other agreement, but since it's been revised.
Lori and I are already ahead of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's gonna email it to me.
Good deal, good deal.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Now,
Ah.
There you go.